A big Murdoch interview, fireworks in a high-profile stand your ground hearing, and the latest on America's hemp industry. I'm Will Folks, the owner and founding editor of FITSNews.com. Welcome to another edition of Your Week in Review. So as the Murdoch murder story continues to drive attention through the release of the recent docuseries, as we look forward to Alec Murdoch's date with the South Carolina Supreme Court sometime in the spring of 2026, we are continuing here at Fitz News to do the work on this story. That means following up on all the arguments that have been raised in Alec Murdaugh's appeal. That means looking at evidence the jury that convicted him didn't see. And it means talking to those who were closest to this story. This week, we sat down with one of the folks who had perhaps the best vantage point on the Murdochs and the immediate aftermath of the murders of Maggie and Paul Murdoch, Blanca Simpson, the family's longtime housekeeper. I'm joined now by our research director, Jen Wood. Jen, you and I were together during that Blanca Simpson interview. You've been doing a deep dive, leading our post-trial coverage of this saga. Before we get going, though, you've got something going on here with your finger, Jen.
Yeah, a little accident.
A little
Just a
accident. What?
little. Let's just say my dog is not nearly as well behaved as Bubba is these days, and a door got slammed on my finger.
And it's apparently the dominant finger on your dominant hand. Do you want to the
It
finger?
is the finger I use the most
Well,
on my dominant
show
hand.
us. There you
See,
go.
there
Okay.
you go. Yep. I'm not going to flip you off in public.
Well, no, you're right. We did get to see Bubba, and that's going to be a big part of this episode because there were some moments you and I both had with Bubba that were kind of chilling, honestly. And
Yeah.
we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, I want to set the stage for this conversation we had with Blanca Simpson. Her testimony during that trial of the century back in March, February, and January of 2023. Her testimony was really one of the first moments where people started to say, wait a minute, this guy, he's concocting an alibi. He's trying to plant seeds of his alibi with people. He's trying to retroactively go back and frame this narrative. And this book that Blanca Simpson has written, Within the House of Murdoch, it addresses a lot of that, but it addresses some other suspicions and things that she saw leading up to and after the murders. What were some of the things from the book, Jen, that really stood out to you as it relates to the crime itself?
What I thought was really interesting is that she said until the trial started and she started hearing some of the evidence, she was not convinced of Alec's guilt. And I think, once she started seeing things come out during the trial, she said it was very difficult for her to watch the trial. But, she did see some of it. And until that point, that is when she became convinced that he was guilty. I thought that was really interesting. And the part that I thought was most interesting about that evidence was the towel. So she spoke of, she had been at their home that day, getting dinner ready for them, doing laundry. And she said in Daniel Green's body camera footage, one of the first officer on the scene, she noticed when he walked up to Alec's truck, a towel on the front seat. And that towel was the moment that she knew he was guilty because she had folded that towel and put it on the shelf in the laundry room prior to leaving that day.
Wow.
So I thought that was really interesting. And she did, when she saw that towel in that footage, try to notify the prosecution to let them know that, just so you know, that towel, that towel was on the shelf when I left the house that day. And they just weren't interested in hearing from her, according to her in the book.
Let's cut to the conversation with her where she references that.
What convinced me was seeing the towel inside his Suburban, the Officer Green's body cam video, when I saw the towel.
This was the very first Colleton County deputy to arrive on the scene. This is the very first footage from the crime scene right after it happened. Tell us about the towel. What made that significant in your mind?
The towel on the seat told me that Alec had been in that laundry room at Moselle. That was one of the towels that I had laundered earlier and folded and placed up on the shelf in the laundry room. And so that told me he went in the laundry room. Also, one of the things that I noticed was Maggie's pajamas in the doorway to the laundry room, which was Maggie would have never done. Maggie would have never left her pajamas stretched out. It looked staged. It looked like it was set up. It was not. That was not Maggie. And I'll say that till I die. Maggie did not do that. And listening to the Mr. Waters said, did you have a burst of energy all of a sudden? And it caught my ear. And then I said, what is he talking about? Because I did not really go through every day of the trial. I did not really want to watch it because I just didn't want to see it. To me, it was hard to watch. But when I heard him say that, I said, wait a minute, what is he talking about? And then I went back, and that's when I listened. I started paying attention, and I kept going back, and I listened to some of where they described that his phone had absolutely no movement, and then all of a sudden he got a burst of energy. And that right there told me the burst of energy was him going in the house, and I guess he must have been in a frenzy, running back and forth. He must have gone in the laundry room, grabbed the towel, because it was like a light drizzle out there. So he must have, dried himself off, then ran in the room. I think he was running back and forth from the master bedroom to the laundry room. The pajamas that were laid out on the floor were in the second drawer of Maggie's side. She had a dresser on as a side table. The pajamas were in the second drawer, and the underwear were in the top drawer, top left drawer, in the back. So to me, that indicated that he set up the scene and was kind of like in a frenzy, just going back and forth, trying to get everything together, I guess, so that he could rush back and do whatever he needed to do.
Now, Jen, you mentioned it took a while for investigators to speak to her, but she also said during our conversation that the way that this case was investigated, it kind of threw shade on her because people thought that she was part of the cover up. In fact, this next clip we're going to watch is Blanca talking about people kind of pointing the finger at her in the aftermath of the murders being part of the cover up. Let's listen to that part.
And I think in our small communities, we don't have that type of crime per se. From especially, a family such as theirs. You don't, you've never seen something like that. And I think there was too many people trying to solve the crime right when it happened. And I believe that needs to be addressed, especially some of the younger rookie officers, that I know they were trying to do their job, and I know they were, being told what they needed to do and all that, and that's fine. But
Did they question you? Did SLED question you?
not for a week and a half later. About a week and a half later passed before they spoke to me.
And obviously they waited to search the house. There were many other.
I had no idea. I was criticized for, it was said that I cleaned the crime scene, that I washed the blood out of the shower, that I, moved stuff around, straightened out. And so it deflected off of law enforcement. And I was the one that basically messed up the crime scene. Well, where was the search warrant on the house? Nobody told me I couldn't go in. Nobody said anything to me. Nobody stopped me. Nothing. I went straight in the house. I stood there. Nobody stopped me. I was never made aware that there was people in that house. I did not know that there was people in the house that night. I didn't know.
So Jen, obviously she's very sensitive to those allegations and making
Right.
perfectly clear she had nothing to do with this.
Right. I mean, I mean, in the aftermath of the murder, she wasn't the first person in that house. That house was, loaded up with attorneys and friends, that evening even. Um, and there was no crime scene tape on it. Nobody telling her not to go in. So, I mean, she was just doing what she was asked. She was doing her job.
Was that an investigatory failure?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
I mean, absolutely. 100%. If they think there was a chance he went up to that house in the aftermath of the murders, that should have been a part of the crime scene.
And she challenged that during our conversation while we were hanging out with Bubba. She pointed out we needed to ask who was calling those shots in the
Right.
immediate aftermath. And she talked about power and money and that was what drove it, according to her. She thought it was, privilege.
Right. 100%.
Yeah. There were revelations in this conversation though that I think kind of just shocked us when we heard them for the first time, where Blanca not only said that she thought Alec had help covering this crime up, but that she knew he had help. And not only that she knew who helped him. You were
Hmm.
sitting there when this happened. I mean, let's watch it first.
Do you think he had help?
I do.
Really?
I do.
I got to ask the next question. Who do you think helped him?
I will not disclose that.
For reasons of,
My safety.
yeah,
My safety. I know who they are.
you do.
I do. I know
You
who
know
they
who
are.
helped Alec Murdoch murder
I believe
his-
I know who they are. Yes. I do.
Yeah, Jen, you were sitting there when that happened. What you think when she said that?
My jaw dropped. I mean, that's always been my belief that he could not have cleaned that crime scene up alone in the amount of time that he had. And giving him time to go establish that alibi. That's always been my thought personally. But to hear somebody say that and that she knows who would have helped him, who did that, I was stunned.
Wouldn't
She
tell us
isn't,
who though.
she would not, she's not naming names. She's very fearful. These people are still around. And I think that's rightfully right. I think that's right to be cautious. But she did say she would tell investigators.
Well, Jen, the other thing interesting in the book, she talks about before the murder, she talks about seeing someone on this tractor moving across the property. She said she initially thought it was Paul Murdoch, but later realized it wasn't. But talked about this dragging the tractor scoop to dig a hole on the property and how that this was part of the property where, and I quote, was thick and heavily wooded areas where even a drone flying overhead wouldn't spot. And that kind of stuck out to me. And she's basically speculating that this was someplace evidence could have been buried. And once again, no search of the house, no search of that property. Seemed like everything was focused on that crime scene.
Absolutely. And that that part stuck out to me in the book and when speaking with her. That property is enormous. I mean, 1,700 acres. There are areas that are heavily wooded. It backs up to the Salcahatchee River. So in terms of disposing of weapons, evidence, there's ample places. And I mean, I know they probably searched the property, but they didn't even lock the house down. How well did they search it?
Yeah. And obviously, we know they did not search the home Murdoch traveled to, his parents' home in
Right,
Alameda, for several months after that. In fact, they didn't search that until October
right,
of 2021. So, some basic investigatory steps that could have yielded evidence, information, were not taken.
right. 100%.
I wanted to dig into this part of it too, because I think one of the things about Blanca's story that people miss is kind of her history. She's someone who, was a former Bureau of Prison investigator. She's somebody who was a correctional officer. She is someone who has a history of investigating Hispanic gangs,
Right.
someone who's got a lot of information, someone who served as a translator in Alec Murdaugh's law firm, and then obviously spent over a decade becoming a very close friend of Maggie Murdoch. But she's someone with a unique, very interesting history here. That what are your thoughts on sort of her background and
I mean, she has a fascinating background, and I think that likely gave her some very good perspective on things that were going on around the Murdochs. She did say that she found narcotics on in his room, in his pockets. So, I think that likely gave her some very interesting perspective.
yeah? So we're learning so much more about all of these characters. We're learning obviously more about Blanca and her story. We spoke recently the text you've uncovered about messages from cell phones that we've linked to another Murdoch family housekeeper, which raised some very potent questions and probing issues about this story. Here's what concerns me, Jen, is all the stuff that we're finding in the aftermath of this trial, all the stuff that we've seen regarding the jury tampering and the alleged jury rigging, all of the things involving Curtis Eddie Smith, cousin Eddie, doesn't seem that there's much interest in pursuing any of this. It doesn't seem like it seems like all the focus is on upholding these verdicts at all costs,
Right.
maintaining this official narrative at all costs. We're not saying this Murdoch guy is innocent. Hell no. This guy's a serial liar, a habitual liar. He lied right up to the moment.
He's not
You
going
know,
anywhere. I mean, just on the financial crimes, he's got decades and decades in prison. He's a horrible person. He's where he belongs.
but does him being a reprehensible thief and a serial liar and a faux repentant fraudster, I don't think his repentance for those crimes is genuine at all. But consider him the most evil person in this story. And I think he is. Doesn't the process matters? Can't we agree that the effort the justice system puts into this should be focused on a result, not necessarily him? And do you think it's almost like I'm starting to believe that they sort of narrowed the scope on this guy
100%.
from the beginning and excluded all other possibilities. And I'm saying that not to say he didn't have a role in what happened, but I'm saying that in the context of potential co-conspirators. Because
Right.
now we got someone on the record saying there was one,
Right.
an accomplice after the fact.
Right.
And in South Carolina, you're an accomplice after the fact to a felony. Guess what? You get the same sentence as the felony.
Right. 100%.
So why are they not pursuing this, Jen?
Did they ever pursue it? Did they ever look at this as a possibility?
It's frustrating.
It drives me
Well, that's why we
crazy.
do this. And that's the other thing is that's why we open these mics to everybody and tell stories like Blanca's story.
Was there ever a geofence warrant done at that house?
Yeah.
Did they say, did they look at, who else could have been there? I don't know, but I've not seen any evidence to that fact.
And I went into this interview this week with Blanca Simpson expecting to hear about Maggie Murdoch, their relationship. They were very close. They were
Right.
friends. They were much closer, I think, than people may have even recognized. I think that says something good about Maggie Murdoch. She formed those kind of relationships. But I left that interview feeling less sure of what we know about this case, less confident in the investigatory findings, and more concerned with what the hell happens if we do have a second trial. I mean, this thing's going to go off the rails.
Absolutely. It will 100% go off the rails. We didn't hear from Curtis Eddie Smith in the first trial. And I think, like Dick Harpootlian said, Alec's attorney, if he had known all of these text messages, he would have called him to the stand. I think if there is another trial, that will absolutely happen. I think there's a lot of questions that need to be answered and should have been answered.
Yeah. Well, I want to shift gears because obviously it was frustrating in the aftermath of that interview to go back and think about how this went down and how the justice system that's supposed to be blind and, as we mentioned, Blanca herself said it was privilege
Right.
driving the show, not not the facts. But I want to shift gears to a moment that I thought was pretty special, which was hanging out with Bubba. I mean, he is definitionally the bestest boy. This
He is
this guy was,
just an old man dog now.
and you were loving up on him first. You got to love up on him first, but
He was so sweet. And he's 12 years old now, so he has calmed down considerably since his days of wreaking havoc at Moselle. He's blind, and he just absolutely adores Blanca. That is his person. You could tell she is the center of his universe. It was great to finally meet
well, he
that
was
dog.
loving all over you at first, Jen.
Oh yeah. Well, me and dog. I love dogs. Um, but yeah, I mean, just it's hard to describe the feelings meeting that dog because he's seen it. He's seen it all. He knows it all. And if dogs could talk, if only dogs could talk. But Bubba and that chicken, that is why Alec Murdoch was convicted, I
Yeah,
think.
he grabbed a chicken, and Alec Murdoch called after him, and that is how we know from that video taken literally 5 minutes before those cell phones of Maggie and Paul Murdoch stopped forever. We know that he was there.
He was at the kennels.
He was there. He lied about it and kept lying about it, and that is
Mhm.
ultimately what convicted him. But I tell you, Jen, the interesting thing Blanca said in our conversation was related to Bubba's interaction with Alec after the murders. In fact, she talked about Murdoch coming back from clearing out his late son's apartment and come back and was dropping some things off. And she said, "Don't you want to see Bubba?" And he was calling the dog, and she said Bubba was hesitant. He let him pet him, but then came running right back to
Right back
Blanca.
to Blanca.
That was telling.
Yeah, I think absolutely it was. And she also talked about how in the 911 call, she could hear Bubba whimpering. She said, she knows his whimpering and she could hear him, which just, kind of breaks your heart.
Yeah. Well, and that to me, of all the things that we saw and heard during our time with Blanca and with Bubba, it was a moment for me. It was all the cameras taken down, all the lights down. Everybody had kind of cleared out, and then Blanca had even gone back upstairs from this basement of this house off the lake. And I remember sitting at the bottom of the stairs, just petting him, and looking in those eyes, and just thinking, if those eyes,
Yeah,
what they've seen, if I mean, they saw it all. They saw
everything.
it all, and it was just kind of haunting to be that close to the lens to everything that happened.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. Well, we said it from the beginning. I mean, we're going to continue to dig on this. We're going to continue to talk to the people who know the truth. We're going to continue to explore and publish the files that haven't been put out there. We're going to continue to track the arguments as this case now moves toward its date with the Supreme Court. Obviously, mixed signals coming from all corners, including Murdoch's defense. They're not completely aligned on whether or not he's going to get a new trial or not. Dick Harpootlian very bullish. Jim Griffin, I believe, a little less optimistic. But this will be a case that it's going to matter in terms of the integrity of our justice system, which has just taken a beating in South Carolina. We've said it often, Jen. This was a case the Palmetto State had to get right. They had to get this case right.
They did not get it right.
That's for damn sure. Again, a lot of folks covering this case are on one team, the other team. At FITSNews, we're on Team Truth. We just want to know what happened. And we will continue to dig and give you our very best effort to uncover just that. So, speaking of high profile cases where the truth is undetermined and perspectives are nebulous, we're shifting gears now to Horry County, South Carolina, where a little over 2 years ago, a fatal shooting off of Highway 9, just south of the North Carolina border, has turned into a huge wrongful death case. Allegations of premeditated murder have been leveled against two of the individuals involved in this shooting, while the one person who was on the other side of it did not live to tell the tale. So this week, our research director, Jen Wood, and I traveled to Conway, South Carolina for a key preliminary hearing ahead of a big stand your ground determination in the case against Weldon Boyd, Kenneth Williams, the two individuals who are accused of shooting Scott Spivey, the late North Carolina insurance adjuster. In fact, they're not accused of it. They did it.
They did it.
They shot him. The question is whether or not they did so fearing for their lives, whether or not they did so in self-defense. That's what we're trying to get to. Jen, this is a case like the Murdoch saga. It has just blown up. It is no longer a case guided by facts and evidence. It is no longer a case guided by witnesses. It is a case that has been, what do we call it? Sensationalized. It's been thrown into this podcast tabloid arena.
Yep.
And in fact, there's a lawsuit alleging that one of the lawyers involved in this case is the one feeding that narrative. We'll address that last week. This week, though, we want to dive into the arguments over the evidence in the case. And so this hearing that we attended in Conway, South Carolina, the key point revolved around two witnesses to what happened. Two witnesses to the vehicular incident, these two trucks chasing each other, Scott Spivey allegedly flashing and brandishing a gun out the window, to the shooting that took place just off of Highway 9 on Camp Swamp Road. So we heard these two 911 calls. We heard the two witnesses say what they saw on those calls. But attorney Mark Tinsley, who represents the family of the late Scott Spivey, is telling the judge in this case, no, Your Honor, we can't just rely on these. We can't have you consider just these. We have to bring these witnesses in here. And there was a huge debate and drama, Jen,
Right.
over why these witnesses were not available, because they want none of this case.
Right.
Hey, before we get into that, I do want to real quickly play just a quick excerpt from the 911 call from Blaze Ward, because this, to me, this was really powerful when we heard it again in the courtroom. Let's listen to that real quick, Jen.
He just turned down, okay, what is the road right here? Camp Swamp Road. Okay. He is pulled over on the side of the road. Actually, I am not, oh my God. I don't know what's going on. He's jumping out of the truck. I'm turning the same way. There is a truck behind him. Okay. And, okay. Oh my God! Oh my God! What happened, ma'am? What happened? Did he fire the gun?
So, Jen, sounds to me like the definition of an excited utterance.
Right. So that is the argument that the defense attorneys for Williams and Boyd are making, that these calls should be allowed in without the witnesses because it is under hearsay exemption, because it is an excited utterance. Now, Mark Tinsley, who's representing Scott Spivey's family, says no, that is absolutely not. We need the witnesses to come in and provide context. The problem is the witnesses stopped cooperating at some point over the past, 6-7 months.
Yeah, and Tinsley accused the attorneys for Weldon Boyd and Kenneth Williams. They said one of their investigators had apparently harassed them or something, but that got a really big clapback from one of the lawyers on the other side, Ken Moss, I believe it was,
Yes.
who straight up accused Tinsley of being the one ginning up these podcasters. So you've got some documentation of this, Jen. What do you think caused these witnesses to go underground?
So, depending on when they went underground, I mean, the Judge Griffith, eventually just said, listen, it doesn't matter. We've got to do our best to get these witnesses in here. But, Boyd and Williams attorneys are saying, they stopped cooperating after a certain podcast released.
Oh, come on. It was our former employees.
I know.
Listen, we don't have to dance around this.
Released their names and basically, told people to reach out to them and instructed their listeners to question why they said that. And to me, and they did. I looked. I can't listen to it, but I looked at the transcript of this episode on July 10th, and they basically gave a roadmap to this woman, this witness of this horrific crimes.
To what end, though? What was
Facebook page?
What was their objective
just
in doing
like
so?
on her Facebook page, and I'm not going to give the same roadmap. She says this in the aftermath of the crime. In her Facebook page is under this name, because it's not under her exact name, it's under her name and a different name. Um, and I think, given the outrage and the publicity that this case has drummed up, people have very strong opinions
Yeah.
about whether or not this was a stand your ground hearing. I think that caused her to undergo a lot of harassment. Um, but the judge said it's irrelevant. We've got to do our best to get these witnesses in here. He is going to make a ruling. He didn't rule from the bench on whether or not they can use the calls with or without the witnesses. But he did say, I want these witnesses to know that we will do everything in our power for them to testify safely if we can get them in here. The problem is they both live out of state, so it's not quite so easy to subpoena them to court.
Jen, the other thing I found really interesting as we're watching this back and forth between these lawyers setting up this stand your ground hearing and the rules of engagement for that hearing is that this is also going on against the backdrop of a criminal inquiry. And we've already had the Attorney General of South Carolina say that, hey, this is a stand your ground situation. We can't prosecute Weldon Boyd and Kenneth Williams uh, for murder in this case because we do believe it was self-defense and there's no evidence to suggest it wasn't. Now, Wilson has since referred that decision as part of a broader file on this investigation to Seventh Circuit Solicitor Barry Barnett, who is going to not only look at allegations of corruption involving Horry County, the police department that investigated this incident, but also Barnett's going to look at that stand your ground determination. So we've got a criminal path that's proceeding, and then we've got this civil wrongful death path that's proceeding. But on the civil side, the loser's got to pay, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So if they bring a stand your ground claim in civil court and the judge finds that it was indeed a stand your ground shooting, um, then the plaintiff who brings the case has to pay attorney's fees.
And these are not cheap lawyers
No,
on either
no.
side.
And there's a lot of them. I
Yeah.
mean, there's two defendants,
Yeah.
two shooters.
Yeah. Jen, this was a contentious hearing. I mean, the flashpoint over who's to blame for these witnesses going underground, but you saw Morgan Martin going up against Mark Tinsley and Ken Moss also going up against Mark Tinsley. These are some adept litigators on this case.
Yeah, definitely very adept litigators. And I think they're frustrated. They're frustrated. The discovery in this case has gone on for quite some time. I think they have resolved a lot of those issues, but not being able to get key witnesses to this shooting into court it's a huge problem. I think I think it's a valid argument, and I understand why they did focus on who caused this to happen. What do we do?
Well, don't you think, though, the judge should take that in consideration? If there's one side that's trying to harass these witnesses, isn't that relevant?
It is absolutely relevant. You know, but if you pull back the lens and look at it, Mark Tinsley didn't harass these witnesses
Yeah.
directly.
Yeah.
Indirectly, who knows?
Although the lawsuit filed against him suggests that it is his actions that are ultimately
Right.
responsible. There was also another lawsuit against these same podcasters that was filed this week. And then there's, of course, this legal action ongoing in the Mallory Beach case, which was the case that started the whole Murdoch saga. And one of our former employees, Callie Lyons, was in that. So we've got all kinds of people throwing all kinds of allegations around.
It's just wild, and
It's exhausting.
it's exhausting, and I just want to work.
Yeah, right, exactly. But it is worth pointing out. I do want to point this out. Callie never worked with us at the same time as Mandy Matney and Liz Farrell. So whatever they've subpoenaed her for, I got no idea.
Yeah, me either.
I mean, that it's clearly related to stuff that she did when she worked for Mandy Matney and Liz Farrell. So whatever they did, who knows? But that's just another example. You saw there were news reports coming out about that, and it's like, what the hell? People
What is happening?
gone around the bend
I know.
on a lot of these cases, and it's hard because We sit here and we look at evidence. We look at crime scene evidence. We look at forensics reports. We look at lab tests. We talk to witnesses,
Court filings.
and we try to lay all the arguments out. And I got to say this, you did an amazing job on your coverage of this hearing. You were down the middle. You laid out arguments for Weldon Boyd and Kenneth Williams' attorneys, and you laid out Mark Tinley's arguments.
Well, it's not my job to pick a side. They both have good arguments. They both have valid arguments. The judge is considering those arguments. I'm not the judge.
Well, Jen, as we approach this pivotal stand your ground hearing, obviously an initial date was set for mid-December. As we mentioned, it looks like that's going to get bumped into 2026. But for the raw, honest, unbiased assessments of where these cases are going, that is why it's so important to tune into media outlets that you trust, that you know are going to give you the lay of the land, both sides, unfiltered, no matter what. And Jen, your work on that and your commitment to doing that, just incredibly proud to have that as part of our media outlet.
Oh, thank you.
Keep it tuned to FITSNews for the latest on that big stand your ground hearing. If you can't smoke it, rope it. That's what one of my old college professors used to say about hemp, which is one of the most versatile crops in the world, but it's one under intense scrutiny at the federal, state, and local level. Now, I'm joined by our Dylan Nolan, who's been tracking this issue. He did a big piece on FITSNews.com about the latest developments for hemp. Dylan, what's happening with hemp?
So, if you can't smoke it, rope it was the idea of the 2018 Farm Bill. And if you don't know, every couple of years, the United States Congress, House, Senate passed this bill which deals with appropriations for the agriculture industry. And it, of course, has a lot of downstream effects, setting policy for what is and isn't allowed in the agriculture industry in the United States. And one of the things that changed in the 2018 Farm Bill was a opening of the door to the farming of hemp. Now, the problem is that if you can't smoke it, rope it actually had some real loopholes in there. And this was actually something that was pushed by very conservative Senator Mitch McConnell, certainly not somebody who had imagined opening a new front on the war on drugs. But the legislation, as it was written, left this, I would say, loophole that became a wide open door for what has become a $30 billion a year industry for making edible, drinkable, smokable even, but still legal until recently, hemp products which contain levels of THC or other compounds that are like THC, THC, of course, being the chemical compound that gets you high in marijuana, that are still legal, that are now being sold at gas stations, liquor stores, you name it. You could probably get a gummy, a drink, or even something that looks exactly like the marijuana that you have to go and get from your non-tax-paying drug dealer, perfectly legally.
Yeah, these are being sold everywhere too. This is not just, alcohol stores where you're confined with what you're allowed to purchase. Alcohol.
No, you don't have to be 21. You don't have to show an ID. Anybody can walk in, cash or credit, and walk out and get absolutely bazooka stoned. And the problem is that there's a lot of these synthetic cannabinoids which are being applied that do really bad things to your body that we don't even understand because we don't study them. And this is a complete gray market where there's no regulation at all. So people are ingesting these things where they think, oh, it's just going to be like smoking some pot. Well, you're smoking spice or K2 as they call it, which is stuff that is closer to like bath salts or, bootleg methamphetamine than it is to marijuana. So it's a real Wild West out there right now, as I'm sure if you look around when you're in a gas station, a liquor store, you see in these places that are liquor store side that they already are, doing some pretty legitimate business. They'll probably have some more refined products. But if you go to a vape shop, say, man, there's some crazy stuff out there. And basically, in this bill to reopen the federal government, although there were small efforts to stop this, they put a 1-year timeline on. Now, if nothing changes, it will effectively kill the whole post-2018 Farm Bill hemp industry. Now, of course, this being a $30 billion a year industry, there's going to be pushback and there's going to be attempts from advocates for this industry to put together less extreme legislation so that folks that aren't, out here selling spice, out here selling K2, people that are actually making rope can continue with their businesses. But as it stands, this would demolish that whole sector. And so basically it gives them a 1-year timeline to come up with some legislation at the federal level to close this loophole and to bring a little bit of order to what is seen, I think, accurately as the Wild West of the current hemp industry.
When you mentioned that Wild West, I was actually going to bring it back to that. SLED Chief Mark Keel, obviously, we talked about his agency earlier in this program, but this is an area where I think he's been remarkably consistent. I think he has said from the beginning of this debate, we are in a climate now that enforceability is impossible. It's impossible for us to enforce these things. And he pulled out some headlines at a recent state legislative hearing about regulating this industry. And I know we're going to talk about it in a second. But he pulled out some headlines about those vape shops you were referring to, Dylan, and some of the violence that's gone on in and around those shops. We actually did a big story on an incident up in Rock Hill where someone under the influence of these substances, perhaps unknowingly, unwittingly under the influence, blew two people away and had no recollection of it after, if the accounts we've been provided are to be believed. That's a dangerous situation. You can see the reason law enforcement would want to have some sort of framework of regulation.
Yeah, and Mark Keel can want whatever Mark Keel wants, but as a consumer, it's also just terrifying that there are these products out here that purport to be one thing and then are completely another. Like if somebody was out here selling what appeared to be a Smirnoff Ice and it was actually Everclear, that would be a problem. And I think, from the consumer perspective, obviously completely shutting it down. Okay, we're back to just, straight prohibition. You got to go to a drug dealer and risk getting shot and all the fentanyl and all the attendant risks on that side. But if they're doing what is being considered in the state of South Carolina right now, which is actually just enacting a regulatory scheme that's not that different from the sale of beer, liquor, wine as it currently stands, like you would be licensed through the state, just like you would if you're a gas station or a liquor store selling beer right now, it would add some level of the state of South Carolina giving its stamp, okay, you can sell this product. This is a safe product.
Yeah, but you mentioned earlier, it's like you take a sip of Smirnoff Ice, you know what you're sipping generally. If you take a sip of Smirnoff Ice and you taste moonshine, that's obviously a dramatically different situation. But these edibles, you don't have that. You take the bite, you don't know any different. It's not like it's something you can immediately recognize. Wait a minute, this is not what I bargained for. This is not what I wanted to buy. There are people who are buying things with the expectation of like a nice mellow high, and yet it turns them into homicidal maniacs.
I'm not completely of the mindset that defendant did not have some homicidal in him before he took those drugs, but I think that's for a jury to decide. But yeah, of course, I don't think that anybody would appreciate being sold something under the belief that you're taking one thing and then holy mackerel, it doesn't even end up being within the neighborhood of what it's advertised as being. Oh, and by the way, there's nobody to, seek accountability with. There's no Smirnoff Incorporated to file a lawsuit against because it's some sketchy product that was imported from halfway across the world by a guy who runs a gas station that has no serious insurance policy.
Yeah, you've got the green bearded guy at the Rock Hill vape shop.
Right.
Yeah, those are not deep.
The RGB LEDs flashing in the windows. I mean, they're popping up at every shopping center across the state.
So as you've researched this, Dylan, and obviously we've got a big hearing on this coming up this week in Columbia, South Carolina, at the State House, as senators are taking up a bill that's already cleared the House.
And it cleared the House in record speed. This stuff was moving quick while the Rose Petal murder trial was happening earlier this year. And so between, in breaks in that court proceeding, I was out in the hallway making phone calls to these legislators that were pushing it. And at the time, I was asking, okay, what's the motivation here? Because really, as it stood in a gray area, it was not illegal. It was legal. But by setting up this regulatory scheme, they are really putting the stamp of approval of the state of South Carolina on what is effectively marijuana. Although marijuana is still obviously federally illegal and there's no indication that that's going to change anytime soon, there will be a product which is in all ways remarkably similar to marijuana. There are differences, but remarkably similar that the state of South Carolina will now be allowing people to purchase and having a regulatory scheme for. And so the reason that they gave at that time was that right now kids are walking into, teenagers are walking into these stores and buying these beverages which have ungodly amounts of THC in them. Like, you go to a marijuana legal state like Colorado, there's going to be an upper cap. It depends on the state, but there's going to be a cap on how much one gummy or one drink can have as far as THC goes.
And that's attributable to the regulatory framework they've constructed.
Right, because they have a regulatory framework. in states like us, where it's, illegal drug dealers and then the guys at the gas stations doing whatever the hell they want to make money, you could get like 1,000 milligram drink. And if you're some 16-year-old who doesn't understand that 1,000 milligram drink is something that you better consume at your house because you aren't going anywhere after that, or at least you shouldn't be if you're driving. There have been serious automobile accidents that have resulted in people going to the hospital. So even if you're not ODing, if you get behind the wheel of a car and get massively messed up by something that you can legally drink while you're driving,
Unbelievable.
I can understand why these lawmakers wanted to step in. Now, a friend of ours, Wesley Donahue, a political strategist in the Palmetto State, who's earned his stripes, he's a hardened political warrior, but he has been quick to point out the fact that the alcohol industry, of course, has an interest in this. Alcohol sales are flagging. My generation does not like drinking. Imagine that. I hate waking up hungover. I hate the risk of getting a DUI driving home. I hate how much it costs to go to a bar. So yeah, I am a member of my generation who's not a big drinker. And I think that that's something that's certainly these alcohol industry people do have an interest in shutting this down. However, I kind of agree. The legislators, because I called some of them this week, and I asked very directly, "Are you guys on the dole of the alcohol industry?" And of course, they're not dumb enough that they would say, "Yes, I'm on the dole of the alcohol
Yes,
industry."
Dylan, we are
But
sellouts.
there is something like very legitimate, I believe, to their desire to have the ability, regardless of what the federal government does, because they can't at the state level enforce federal laws. They want the ability to set up South Carolina's own regulatory framework, and if somebody's breaking that, to be able to send in the state law enforcement division or your county sheriff or local, municipal police to go and enforce the state law so that they're not reliant on the federal government. Because as we've seen, depending on who's in the White House and what the tone at the top is, the federal government can just choose to not enforce its own laws. And of course, we saw that under Joe Biden's administration when they would refuse to go prosecute these felons who would be caught with guns, which is a great way to keep a felon who has proven that they're the kind of person who gets out of prison and goes and gets another gun and keeps acting like a criminal off the streets. So I get it. The state does not want to be beholden to whether or not the federal government decides to enforce the law on any given day.
Well, you made a good point too in your coverage, noting that some in the industry view this as an opportunity to shut down competition, the alcohol industry, but others view it as a chance to open up a potential new revenue stream.
Yeah, and we saw like the craft beer explosion, the IPA explosion of, the mid 2010s. Well, a lot of those firms are going bust right now because it turns out people don't like drinking beer that tastes like spoiled oatmeal, or at least not in large enough quantities to fill the dozens and dozens of breweries that have cropped up in all the old industrial buildings in every city in the country. And so I think a lot of these firms that have inventive entrepreneurs behind them are like, what's the pivot? What's the next thing? And this is the pivot for a lot of them. But I think the big money in the alcohol industry, I don't know that they see this as a potential revenue stream. So I do think that although there are people that are trying to pitch this as, oh, some in the alcohol industry, don't like that we're doing this. I don't know if I believe that. I think the smart money in the alcohol industry is on killing their competition.
Indeed. South Carolina has been a state where issues related to medical marijuana hemp have been hotly debated in the South Carolina General Assembly in recent years. Clearly, this is another emerging front in that battle, but as Dylan's pointing out, it's got some layers that go even deeper than that. Dylan, you did an amazing job covering this, wrapping that federal stuff in with what's happening in the state. And you and I think are heading downtown for that hearing next week. So we will keep our audience in the loop on the very latest as the nationwide hemp battle unfolds here in South Carolina. All right, folks, that's a wrap for another edition of Your Week in Review. Remember, next week is when we do it live, the month in review. And as we continue to toy with the format and the timing, be on the lookout for a special Black Friday edition of the show. It'll air at 7 p.m. next Friday, Black Friday. Again, month in review live here on FITSNews, 7 p.m. next Friday. We'll see you then.